Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're popping the hood on AI generative models to see exactly how they manage to turn pure static into breathtaking art. And we're going to do it without getting completely bogged down in heavy calculus. If you've ever typed a prompt into an AI image generator, gotten a photorealistic result back, and thought, wait, how does that actually work? You are absolutely in the right place. We are breaking down the math of diffusion models and flow matching, taking the complex equations from cutting-edge research and translating them into clear, intuitive concepts. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the core idea of diffusion, then dive into DDPM and how we reverse noise with probability. From there, we'll look at some neat variance reduction tricks, shift gears into DDIM to see how we reverse with velocity, and finally, we'll wrap up with the big one, the flow matching generalization. All right, let's jump right into part one, the core idea of diffusion. At its heart, generative modeling is all about taking a set of training data, let's say thousands of images of dogs, and figuring out how to systematically create brand new ones. And to be clear, the goal isn't just to copy and paste an existing dog image. We want to build a sampler that understands the underlying dog distribution so intimately that it can hallucinate a totally original, highly realistic image. But here's the catch. Sampling directly from that incredibly complex target distribution is nearly impossible. So diffusion models use a really clever trick. They take that single, massive, impossible leap and break it down into a long sequence of very tiny, very easy steps. This brings us to the forward process, which is honestly kind of brutal. We take a perfectly clean image and we systematically destroy it with Gaussian noise until it becomes pure, unrecognizable static. Notice how the data completely transforms. We start with our target data, and step by step, we just keep injecting independent Gaussian noise. Eventually, after enough of these steps, the original image is totally obliterated. What we're left with at the very end is essentially just a standard, super easy to sample Gaussian distribution. Moving on to part two, DDPM and reversing with probability. So, we've successfully created a giant mess of noise. The obvious question now is, how do we possibly reverse that chaos to actually get an image back? Think about it. If we can figure out how to take a sample of pure noise and step by step remove the static to perfectly walk backward along that exact same path, we'd end up with a brand new sample from our original target distribution. But learning the exact reverse conditional distribution for every single individual step, that sounds like an absolute mathematical nightmare. But here is the massive revelation, what the foundational research paper calls Fact 1. If our noise steps are tiny enough, reversing them is literally just a simple Gaussian distribution. Because the forward steps add such microscopic tiny increments of noise, the reverse distribution closely mirrors the forward one. We don't have to map out some wild, impossible mathematical space. We just need to find a Gaussian distribution. And to define a Gaussian, you really only need to know two things, the mean and the variance. So the absolute game changer here is the regression trick. By predicting the mean of the noise, we reduce what looks like an impossible image generation problem into a totally straightforward regression task. We already know the variance because we defined it in our forward noise schedule, right? So learning the mean is the only missing puzzle piece. We can just train a standard neural network to look at a noisy image and guess the mean of the previous, slightly less noisy step. The magic here is that we've taken the lofty, abstract goal of creating art, and we've transformed it into a highly solvable, almost mundane image denoising problem. And here is how that actually looks in practice. This is the DDPM algorithm, which acts as a stochastic reverse sampler. It uses probabilistic randomness to basically bump its way back to a clean image. You start by sampling pure noise, and then you loop backward. At each step, your trained neural network predicts the mean of the previous step. Then, and this is a really crucial detail, because it's a stochastic process, you add a little bit of calculated random noise back in before moving to the next step. You're essentially rolling the dice at every tiny increment to probabilistically navigate from total static back to a pristine image. Now for part 3, let's talk about some variance reduction tricks. It turns out predicting the immediate previous step isn't the only way to reverse this process. Actually, estimating the initial starting point, the clean image itself, reduces variance and seriously stabilizes the math. If you're at a super noisy step, predicting just the tiny bit of noise added in the immediate previous step is surprisingly difficult and highly prone to variance. But because all the previous noise steps essentially look identical from your current vantage point, you can instead train the model to predict the total accumulated noise. Mathematically, this is the exact same thing as predicting the original, clean image, often called x0. You make that big prediction, then just scale it down for a much more stable computation. But keep this in mind. When the model predicts this expectation from noise, it's outputting a blurry mathematical mix. It is not a crisp, finalized photograph. If you were to ask the model halfway through the reverse process, hey, what do you think the final image is going to be? It wouldn't hand you a perfect picture of a dog. It gives you an expectation. It's a cloudy amalgamation of all the possible dogs that could theoretically emerge from that specific pattern of static. It only really gets crisp at the very end of the process.
All right, part 4, DDIM and reversing with velocity.
Let's pivot for a second because there's a massive contrast between the approach we just looked at, DDPM, and a newer method called DDIM. DDPM relies heavily on probabilistic randomness, right? Bumping around in the dark. With DDPM, the final image you get is largely independent of the specific static you started with, simply because of all those random dice rolls along the way. But DDIM, which stands for Denoising Diffusion Implicit Models, is entirely deterministic. It completely changes the game. If you start with the exact same seed of noise in DDIM, you will get the exact same image every single time. It maps a direct, unyielding route. This deterministic reverse sampler acts less like rolling dice to find an image and much more like calculating a precise trajectory. Notice how there is no random noise injection step here, like we saw in DDPM. Instead, the model computes an update that pushes the sample directly toward the target distribution based on a calculated ratio. To really wrap our heads around what DDIM is doing, it helps to borrow a concept from physics. Imagine a cloud of gas particles. Instead of tracking a single noisy image bumping around randomly, picture millions of particles of pure noise. The DDIM algorithm acts as a velocity field for this gas. At every point in space and time, it tells a particle exactly which direction to flow and how fast to move in order to systematically condense back into the shape of our target data. It's moving from chaos to order with absolute deterministic purpose. You can actually visualize this exact velocity field, with particles of noise being seamlessly pulled toward the target data. If your target was just a single point mass, the arrows of the velocity field would point directly at it, flowing smoothly from the outer edges of pure noise right into the center. The algorithm calculates the weighted average of these velocities to guide the entire distribution of noise gracefully back into the shape of whatever data we trained it on. But there's a catch. We absolutely have to avoid the pitfall of memorization. A truly good model learns the underlying structure of the data, like the spiral shape shown here, rather than just copying a few training points. Think about it. If you only train your model on 10 data points, the DDIM trajectories just collapse exactly onto those 10 dots. It literally just memorized them. But as you provide more and more data, the velocity field begins to map out the true underlying manifold. The paths flow beautifully into the entire spiral shape, which proves the model has actually learned the generalized structure, not just copy-pasted the training set. Finally, we arrive at part 5, the flow matching generalization. Flow matching takes everything we've just learned and generalizes it into a brilliantly simple 3-step recipe for generation. First, you pick an easy-to-sample-based distribution, usually Gaussian noise. Second, you choose a coupling, which is just a fancy way of saying you decide how a specific point in your noise distribution connects to a specific point in your target data. And third, you choose an explicit pointwise flow. That is the specific geometric path a particle will take to get from point A to point B. It takes all this complex theory and turns it into a completely modular framework. So why is this such a big deal? By dropping the strict Gaussian assumptions, flow matching lets us draw highly efficient, custom paths between noise and data. It's a massive upgrade to our generative toolkit. We are no longer chained to the idea of just adding noise. With flow matching, you can map between any two distributions you want. You can even use what are called rectified flows, where the path from static to image is a mathematically perfect straight line. Why does that matter? Because straight lines mean the generation process is incredibly fast and computationally cheap. It is exactly why modern AI image and video tools are getting so incredibly fast right now. And the craziest part? It turns out that the DDIM algorithm we just spent time looking at is actually just a very specific, slightly curved special case of this much broader flow matching universe. So as we master exactly how to reverse the chaos, what impossible creative landscapes are these models going to help us map out next? We've gone from probabilistically bumping around in the dark to drawing precise, deterministic straight lines from pure static to stunningly realistic data. The mathematical elegance running under the hood of these systems is honestly just as beautiful as the art they produce. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.